Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Ask the Expert Special Edition with Noah Kerr, our sound engineer. Noah is going to be talking with us about sound in our sanctuary. So, Noah, thank you for being with us this morning.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. Could you tell everybody a little bit about how you got to be a sound technician, engineer person?
Yeah. Well, I've heard the old phrase, curiosity killed the cat. As a child, I was really curious about how these microphones work, and I was an avid fan of listening to radio music. I grew up in a part of the country in the Great Lakes where I could get really great radio broadcasts from Chicago. I lived not too far from Detroit. I could pick up radio signals from as far away as I remember Nashville, Tennessee. I remember listening to WLS and WJR, and I was curious about why the sounds of those recordings that were being played on the radio, why those were different from what I was hearing in church, and why they were different from the music that I would hear performed live. And as time went on, I was fortunate enough to get to have a chance to get up close and personal with some of that equipment. I had some elder peers who were really kind and inviting. And it gave me an opportunity to start getting a hands-on, albeit informal experience, to just how to make some of the stuff work on a basic level. And along with that comes as many frustrations and challenges and questions as it does skills and opportunities. And so I spent enough time working as a result of that in live sounds. When you think of concerts, you think of live performances, how microphones and how recording devices and things like that are used, that by the time I was in college, it was a set of skills that I found marketable and was able to continue working from that. But I never really lost that fascination with, again, how music was recorded, not just broadcast or played through speakers, but how you put sounds together to make something that sounds really unique that you want to keep coming back to and listening time and time again. I grew up with 45 RPM records and LPs, and to a certain extent cassette tapes and reel-to-reel tape. But even now into the present, I think it's a really fascinating process. And so that's, when I was finishing up with college, that was what I wanted to do. I wanted to make records. And so I was able to do that for a few years, working as a recording engineer and eventually as a record producer, that it was something I was able to explore more. But that has not made me any less curious about it, especially as technology has continued changing, as music and tastes in popular music have continued changing. That's been something I continue to try to follow as I'm able with the little time available these days.
Well, when you're in a PhD program, you've got a few other things to think about, and of course, being a father and a husband and a member of our church, where you volunteer so kindly to do this work for us.
Glad to help.
So sound is definitely an important part of our worship life together. I mean, it's a really important part of life in general. But Noah, I was hoping you could start just by talking a little bit about our sanctuary and sound and how they interact.
Sure. That's a broad idea, but I think that when we're talking about things as broad as church, it's appropriate. I would say to start out, it's important to understand that we have the sound in the sanctuary not only as a way of helping everyone hear, but the way that the sanctuary sounds in terms of a space is different for a reason. If you've ever thought about when you walk into the space for a church or for a meeting, you hear a change, and that change helps us prepare ourselves in some way. And I think that's important to kind of keep in mind. But on a more practical level, on a more mundane level, when we're talking about just being able to hear worship, sometimes that presents problems. A big boomy space is a space where there are many kinds of sounds bouncing all over the place, and some of those we're aware of, some of those we're not. A couple of examples being the way that air is pumped into the room. The HVAC system makes noise.
Yeah.
And when we're not really paying attention to that, our minds tune that out naturally, but at the same time, it is there. And so when you start talking about using microphones to pick up some sounds and not others, these are considerations we have to take into account. Other examples are just the way that we talk to each other. If we're talking during the prelude, during the service, in one part of the sanctuary, we're going to hear that differently based on where we're sitting. And I know a number of us notice that if we've ever sat in different places or spent time in different parts of the sanctuary.
Where do you think the sound would be best, just off the top of your head? I mean, we've got this big circular space up front, and we've got chairs there, and then we have the whole back area with just pews. If you were trying to get like the best seat for hearing, where would you sit?
Well, that's a great question, and I'll say that's a question I've been asked a number of different times, and not only just in this church, but the simple answer is that there is not one best place. I will say, though, that there are definite advantages to sitting up in front of where the dome of the sanctuary, so for most of us, where the round part of the room begins to arch up. That most of the way the sound is set up in terms of the speakers, in terms of where the instruments are, now in terms of where the hearing loop is put in, all those things are a little more advantageous because the roof is blocking certain kinds of sounds differently there than it is in the back. And in the back, you're getting a lot of those sounds bouncing away from you before it ever reaches you.
Okay. Well, and so that's makes me think of the next question. I've heard, and I don't know much about sound or music really, but I've heard that our sanctuary is really good for singing, for maybe the piano, but not as good for just speaking and not as good for like drums. Can you tell us why that might be?
Sure. Well, I think it's a great way to start out answering that question is to think about how sound, when we think of low sounds and high sounds, sounds that sound shrill, sounds that sound boomy or bassy, those are all sounds that coexist together across what we call the frequency spectrum. And without getting too technical, essentially what that is when you have all these different sounds lumped together, all of this different sound energy bouncing around all over the place, some spaces make those sounds bounce around a lot more chaotically and a lot more energetically, reflecting those all over the place than others. Our sanctuary is a place where many of the low frequency sounds, so bassy sounds, deep sounds, those bounce around a lot. So when you think of those low notes on the piano, and especially the organ, those are sounds that are constantly moving all over the place. But as they move all over the place, they become less distinct. They get muddy. They're constantly bouncing off not only walls and furniture and even us, but they're bouncing off each other. And so the more that happens, the harder it is to be able to distinguish some of the specific kinds of characteristics of the sounds that help us know what they are, that help us think, oh yeah, that's a bright, crisp piano, or that's a flute. And so to answer your question a little more directly, the sanctuary that we have, and especially the front of the sanctuary, is a space where there is a lot of that reflection happening. And that reflection usually favors higher types of frequencies.
So like singing?
Yeah, especially when you think of the kinds of frequencies, the kinds of sounds that help our ears know that's a human voice, or that's a group of human voices singing together with those sounds bouncing off each other. It's really advantageous for that. But when you talk about instruments that have a lot of that low, deep, bassy content that's less distinct, it gets cluttered up and more chaotic much more quickly, you're talking about instruments like organ, like drums, like piano. Piano's a unique challenge that we don't often think of because we usually listen to it either by itself or accompanying a much louder sound source like a whole sanctuary of people singing. But
right.
a piano is challenging because it has all of those frequencies. It has the entire spectrum from the bottom to the top, and it's a very complex instrument. And so it's one that it can be really difficult when it comes to not just listening to it acoustically, but trying to use microphones to pick up some of it, to put it, say, into a hearing loop for people who have hearing aids, or to try to record it in a way that sounds very natural and very pleasing in a worship setting as opposed to maybe in a different style, so maybe jazz or pop music, that type of thing. They're important differences.
Okay. Well, so then you mentioned the hearing loop, and we've talked a little bit about it right after we got it, especially when we were preparing to get it. But can you show us? Is it?
Yeah, of course.
Is it somewhere around here?
Well, the hearing loop itself is actually not right here. We
Okay.
have one component. We have, you can take a look down here. We have this little box with this sort of glowing eye on it right here. And this is the amplifier. And an amplifier is just a fancy word for this is the place that provides the power to make what is going into the hearing loop loud enough so that people can pick it up.
Okay.
And sound comes from a certain part of the mixing board, the sound console right here, gets sent into that amplifier, and that provides enough energy to send it out through a wire that's laid underneath the floor throughout a vast majority of the room.
So is it like...
It goes right underneath, actually, show you real quick. It comes right down out of the back and actually goes down. It's hidden underneath
the base?
The crown molding, underneath the carpet, and goes all the way around the room in a loop. Hence it being called a hearing loop.
Okay.
And what makes that really advantageous is it provides the opportunity for people, no matter where they're sitting, to have some access to information that might be difficult to pick up if it's bouncing off a wall, or for people who have hearing loss in the congregation. Almost all adults who are over age 50 or 60 have some natural hearing loss in terms of those high frequencies. And so referring to what we were talking about earlier, what I mentioned in terms of how high frequencies help us distinguish between different kinds of sound, different kinds of information, that's a really critical part of hearing. And so the hearing loop is designed to provide the opportunity for people to have a more direct access to the types of sounds that would otherwise only reach their ears after bouncing off and getting kind of muddled through sometimes other sounds as well.
All right. Okay, so that's the hearing loop. And then this situation, I have not used soundboards much, but this is also part of what helps us hear when we're in the sanctuary. Microphones, speakers, that. Can you explain it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the best way of understanding the system as a whole is just to quickly walk through piece by piece what's going on. So when we talk about a microphone, we're talking about a device that is picking up the pressure of sound and turning it into electricity.
Okay.
And that electricity gets sent through a cable, or in the case of like your headset mic, the microphone that you wear on your belt underneath your vestments, that gets sent as a radio signal into these receivers. So both the cables from the microphones and the receivers are sending electricity into lots of different plugs on the back of the soundboard. And there are many, many cables. There's a mass, quite a few different things that are coming in if you want to bring in the shot. So each one of these is a distinct and separate place that sound is coming from in terms of a microphone or another device. Here's where they get all mixed together. We get to use different tools within this device to decide how loud, sometimes which should be on, which should be off, so that the result of combining all these sounds together is not only pleasing, but is practical. For example, when we're listening to the choir, maybe we don't want to hear the sound that's coming through the pulpit microphone. Or maybe we don't want to hear an accidental sneeze that comes from the lector when the choir is performing. And so it's important to use this type of technology to make different choices about what we want to hear, maybe what we don't want to hear, and to use that to manage the sounds that can be adding to worship, that can manage the sounds that maybe are distracting from worship. And at that point, all the sounds are combined together into one output, meaning one group of sounds that are coming out that gets sent. If we go through this door here, they come out through wires that are built into the walls, and come up into this cabinet. And we have a number of devices here. The surprise is that they're just more amplifiers. Just like with a hearing loop, we have devices to give enough electrical power to make speakers move. And that's what these devices do. They send that electricity up to the speakers that are mounted in the ceiling, which are back in the sanctuary behind us here. If you take a peek up, right up on the ceiling, we have speakers here and there. And all together, those are what are sending sound to our ears. So when we think of sound coming from a microphone, what we're actually hearing is sound being pushed out of those boxes up on the ceiling. Likewise, when we hear things that we don't want to hear, we wonder, why is the microphone working that way? It's actually coming from the speakers.
Okay. Well, thanks for that. I think that's a great kind of explanation of our equipment and whatnot. And there's separate speakers for the organ, right, down in the back by the doors. And so
actually in the corners, so if all the big boxes, all the big speakers in the room, there are 4 of them. And 2 of them, the big ones in the back corner of the sanctuary, those handle most of the lower notes.
got it.
So you notice that an organ has 2 keyboards or 2 manuals. And the lower manual is going to 1 pair of speakers, and the upper manual, the higher keys that play sometimes those more powerful notes, those are going to these speakers up in the corner.
Okay. So, really fast, like some of the things that sometimes go wrong.
Yeah.
I know that sometimes we'll hear feedback when we turn on Andrew or my mic. What's happening there?
Yeah. The reality of feedback is that when you have enough electrical power pushing a speaker, creating sound coming out of a speaker, it can get back into a microphone that is also listening to sound and then feeding it back to the soundboard, feeding it to the amplifier, feeding it up to the speaker. And so what you have is literally a vicious cycle. And as that cycle continues, sometimes only in the matter of just a few, maybe even less than a second, but sometimes a few seconds, it cumulatively builds up those high frequencies. And that what we associate with that is a kind of screeching sound or kind of a piercing sound. It's those higher frequencies.
Okay.
And so one way we guard against that, we have tools in the soundboard that help eliminate some of those frequencies. But the rule of thumb there is typically to only be having the microphones that are, only be using the microphones that we currently want picking up sound.
And we just turn them on and off here, right?
Yep. And those are mute switches. And it's
Mute
literally what it is. It's muting whether or not it's
Right.
operational. So right now, there's only one microphone that's turned on.
Got it. So another thing that can happen is that sometimes I think our mics get too close to our mouths.
Mm-hmm.
And can you tell us what that does?
Yeah, definitely. So a classic belief is that if you want to be heard better, if you want the microphone to be more effective, you somehow need to have it closer to your mouth. And I'll just demonstrate actually with this microphone what you're actually doing when that's happening. So I'm talking here, you can hear, but as I get much closer, the quality of the sound is really degraded. And the reason for that is that what the microphone is actually listening to is, as I mentioned earlier, sound pressure. And there's a lot of pressure right around your mouth, including the air that's actually coming out from your nose at a certain angle. There's sound that's certainly emanating through your throat. A microphone can hear what's coming from your throat. But altogether, that pressure is largely coming from your mouth. And the pressure can push a microphone past the point at which it sounds good.
Right.
And a microphone can't keep up with that. And so having it be too close, without going into the different kinds of microphones, without explaining how some are built for that, some are not, generally, if you're getting too close, what sound engineers call eating the microphone. If you get too close, you're actually putting a lot more of that low frequency, boomy, high pressure energy, and it's not only making what you're saying less distinct, it's distorting, as you just heard.
Yeah.
It's distorting that sound and making it troublesome from a worship standpoint, distracting.
Yes. Okay, so I have noticed that, especially when I'm editing worship, because now we're worshiping online, and so there's times where I try to edit out when I'm like, well, you can't hear that, but that's like me breathing. So if I had a microphone right near my face, you'd hear me breathing, and I try to edit that out, but that's a little harder. So on that note, if you could tell us a little bit about the challenges when you only have 2 to 5 people in a room recording. Like, what are you thinking about to try, because you're here organizing it all, when you're miking everybody and trying to make it work?
Yeah, something we don't often think of is how much a difference it makes to have a room, a sanctuary full of the congregation, that not only are we gathering together for religious reasons, but we're really changing the way the room sounds because our bodies are absorbing some of those sounds. Other sounds don't have the opportunity to bounce off a pew or a wall or another hard reflective surface. And so the result of that is that the room is a different sounding place. So if we're recording material for services, we're recording a space that is much more lively, that has a lot more echo
and reverberation. If I were to use a really loud voice in here, you can hear that decay from the end of my voice. And that's a consideration that we have to take into account when we're recording. One, because our ears, when we're listening to recordings, especially with headphones, our ears are not blending together a lot of those sounds and making a mixture that our minds are happy with. What they're actually doing is only being able to take selective things and still have to try to sort them out. And so because recording only takes bits and pieces out of that, we have to be a lot more careful about the kinds of microphones we use, about how loud we put them into the recording. And then after these are all recorded individually, some of the choices I have to make about how to combine them so that they sound pleasing, whether that's music or whether that is the sound of somebody speaking at the pulpit. So some of those choices are very basic. The choices like which is the right microphone to use. Other choices are where in the room. A place that's right up against a wall can be really problematic for sound, even if though it looks really great with the beautiful liturgical art that we have in the space with all the color and light. Putting somebody right up against a wall can mean that a microphone is hearing the sound, like you're fairly close to the wall. The microphone, when you speak, is hearing not only what's coming from your mouth to the microphone, it's hearing what's bouncing off the wall and also going. And so lots of these kind of considerations come into play much more when we're recording in a quiet room, when we can hear things like the HVAC system, than when we have a room full of people who are helping to buffer the sound and who are maybe creating a little bit of noise all on their own. So they're different creatures.
Yeah. So I know that it's sometimes confusing because we have cameras and like the way we think about it at home, if we had like a video camera, often that's what's also getting the sound. But here, our cameras are separate, right? We have the cameras and then we have what's coming into the soundboard. Those are two separate things. And putting them all together is like part of that process then of getting it onto a recording so that you can see it on your computers. So that's all. It's not always perfect. We try really hard, but it's certainly much more complex than just when I used to take a camcorder and just point it and hope that it gets the sound and the visual. So is there anything else you'd like to add before we close?
Yeah, I think just a couple of quick points. First of all, when we're making recordings, the recordings are not only performances on video. In some cases, they have to be performances that we catch in terms of the sound. Because we're committing all of those different microphones into the same recording at the same time, we don't have the chance to change them later. We can polish them a little bit. Sometimes we can make some compromises down the way, but we're not able to make, say, somebody's voice louder and the piano softer after the recording is made. And that's a compromise that we choose to make because of the way the room sounds. So that's one thing to kind of keep in mind about that. And another is just that with the opportunities that we have, the tools that we have available, we're able to try to make some parts of worship work in this day and age that might be more difficult otherwise if we didn't have these assets. And that's something that I'm personally really appreciative of. I'm appreciative to have this kind of space to begin with to work with. My background as a recording engineer deals a lot more with how to control sounds and how to try to fight off problems than how to use a great sounding space to make something that sounds even more beautiful than it might have to begin with just very basic sources. So that's I think something that we can all kind of keep in mind is that we have some assets shared together in the church that really do help make our jobs easier in some ways, even though they, as we talked about, they do bring some challenges as well.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for tuning in. If you have any questions, shoot us an email. Actually, don't shoot me an email because Noah will know more than I do, but you can always call or email me too. And we'll continue to work to make this experience something that we can all participate in and hear and see as best as possible. So thanks and have a great day.